Salut, moi c'est Jérôme Vermelin et vous écoutez Les gens qui lisent sont plus heureux. Et si, à l'heure où les réseaux sociaux vampirisent nos cerveaux, prendre le temps d'ouvrir un livre était devenu un acte de résistance? Ce podcast, c'est celui des passionnés de lecture, sous toutes ses formes, sans préjugés. Dans cet épisode, je vous propose un entretien exceptionnel avec James Frey, l'un de mes écrivains américains préférés. L'un des plus controversés de sa génération aussi.
I read books every day, right? I became a writer in large part because I loved reading books and because I read one specific book that lit me up. But I can't imagine a life without books.
En 2003, ce natif de Cleveland a 34 ans lorsqu'il publie 1000 morceaux, un véritable phénomène d'édition. Présenté comme les mémoires d'un toxicomane repenti, dans un style brutal, percutant et sans concession, le livre vaut à son jeune auteur d'être invité sur le plateau de la célèbre Oprah Winfrey qu'il adore. Le hic, c'est que James a légèrement romancé son coup d'éclat littéraire. Pour ne pas dire beaucoup. La presse lui tombe dessus à bras raccourcis, le traite d'imposteur et il est obligé d'avouer la supercherie, en dépit de son indéniable talent d'écrivain qu'il confirme ensuite avec Mon cousin Léonard, L.A. Story et Le dernier testament de Ben Zion Avraham. Ces dernières années, James s'était consacré à la littérature jeunesse, avec des sagas vendues à prix d'or au cinéma. Le truc, c'est qu'il n'était pas très heureux, et que tôt ou tard, l'écrivain sulfureux des débuts devait refaire surface. C'est chose faite avec Katrina, une sorte de préquel de 1000 morceaux, drôle, tragique, sensuel, en librairie en France le 21 août. Katrina, c'est l'histoire de Jay, un écrivain à succès qui se remémore son séjour à Paris lorsqu'il avait 20 ans et sa rencontre avec un jeune mannequin qui va bouleverser son existence. De passage dans la capitale, en pleine canicule, James m'a reçu dans les bureaux de son éditeur Flammarion, en plein cœur du quartier latin qu'il affectionne. Je vous propose d'écouter cet entretien en version originale, sans doublage ni trucage, même si avec James Frey, on ne sait jamais tout à fait où se situe la vérité. Welcome, James.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure meeting you in Paris for a book that's set mostly in Paris. You'll tell me about.
I'm happy to be here. I love Paris.
And it seems that that French people love you more than Americans lately, I guess.
Yeah, I have a complicated relationship with Americans, right? About half of them love me and about half of them hate me, and I'm pretty cool with that. But I do love it here. I love being here. I love the French. I've lived in France a couple times. It's good to be back.
So Katrina is set in Paris when you were younger, when you were around 20 years old. We'll talk about it, but first I have to tell you that I was waiting for an adult novel from you for a long time, for quite a long time, and I was not really interested in the more young adult books that you did. And a few months ago, I discovered that you had a new book, so I went through the reviews, through the American, British reviews, and they were terrible.
They were.
And I was dying to read it. Do you think sometimes bad reviews are better than nothing?
I don't mind bad reviews. I always say when I write a book, I want to polarize opinion. I want people to either love it or hate it, and I want nothing in between. And I've never been a darling of the media. I don't pander to them, and I don't particularly even care what they have to say. Sometimes the bad reviews just make me laugh. I read them; they don't bother me. I like that I forced the reader to have an opinion and to react, and to feel something, even if it's not good. I think that's the goal of books, and that's the goal of art, is to make the people experiencing them feel things. And in my life, all of the artists and writers I admire most do that. They don't walk the middle path. They force people to take an opinion, to take a position on what they do, and it's usually either very positive or very negative. So I didn't mind.
It's interesting that you say that, because My podcast is called Les gens qui lisent sont plus heureux. People who read books are happier than others. And I always ask that as a question to my guests. Do you think people who read books are happier than others?
Yeah, I think they're happier. I think they're smarter. I think they're more sophisticated. I think they're more open to the world and to other people. I read books every day, right? I became a writer in large part because I loved reading books and because I read one specific book that lit me up. But I can't imagine a life without books, without words, without stories, without the feelings and experiences that those things bring me. So yeah, I often, when I meet people for the first time, I'll say like, what are your favorite books? What are you reading? Just out of curiosity, because it tells you a lot about what they're interested in.
And if they don't read books, some people tell me, I talk to them about my podcast and they say, oh, I wish I had time to read books. What do you say to them?
You know, live and let live. But at the same time, like I know very smart, very successful people in New York who almost brag about the fact that they don't read. And I'll just be like, once I sort of know them, I'll be like, dude, that's a stupid thing to brag about. It just makes you seem like small-minded, right? And ignorant and unwilling to learn about life and the world and what this all is or isn't, right? I can't imagine not reading books. Books make me deeply happy, and have my whole life. And writing them does too.
Katrina made me very happy because I was happy to read a new James Fry book.
Thank you.
It's both very energetic and melancholic book. It's sad at times. It's a very romantic book also. It seems that you had to get out many emotions to write this book, and I'm curious to know why you didn't before, because since it's based on your past, on your memories, were you waiting to be ready, and what led you to write this one?
I wasn't waiting to be ready. I hadn't, as you said, I hadn't written an adult book in a long time. I think Final Testament came out in 2011. And I'd been doing a lot of other things. I ran a business that published 250 books. We made movies, we made TV shows, we made video games. After the Final Testament, I actually write about it in Katerina. I had written 4 books. The first 3 had all hit #1 in America. The 4th I published through Gagosian, the famous art gallery, very deliberately to not sell 1 million books, but to make a beautiful book. I published it normally in France and Europe. And I was just kind of done. I was just burnt out. It had been a pretty wild ride, those first 4 books. You know, those first 4 books sold 25 million copies around the world and had been very, very controversial and very, very divisive. And I was just kind of done. I was lying in a hotel room in Paris, not far from here, on Rue Dauphine.
You were crying.
Yeah, it was the middle of the night. I was tired, and I was just like, I did it, right? The dream I write about in Katerina, I pulled it off. And it had taken a lot from me, right? It had taken big chunks of my soul. And so I went and did a bunch of other stuff for a few years. And then about a year and a half ago, I was really depressed and suicidal, and I called a buddy of mine and I was like, man, what the fuck do I do? And he sort of started making fun of me, right? He was like, where are you? I was like, I'm in Connecticut. He's like, oh, you're at your big house in Connecticut? I sort of live in a place equivalent to living in Fontainebleau, right, in Paris. He's like, oh, you're in your big house in Connecticut? He's like, what are you wearing? I was like, you know, khakis and a polo. He's like, are your earrings in? I was like, no. He's like, you gotten into any trouble lately? I was like, no. He's like, yeah, man, you want to kill yourself because you lost yourself. You're just some chump now. You're just some chump, rich chump living living out in the woods.
So you lost yourself through the company, through the young adult books, the video games?
Through not doing what I love to do. Those things are all kind of fun, and they're certainly profitable, and you can have a nice life doing those things, but it wasn't my heart. Right?
On your Wikipedia page, it says that you're a writer and a businessman, which I was concerned about.
I haven't read my Wikipedia page probably in 15 years, so I have no idea what it says.
But I'm not sure they're saying this from other writers. So did you become a businessman more than a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. I ran a business. I started a business, I ran it, I sold it. I still work for the company. I actually work for a French company that bought it. My boss lives in Paris.
What's the name of the French company?
It's called Webedia.
Webedia, okay. Mm-hmm.
And I like working for them. They're great. They're cool and smart, and I enjoy that job in certain ways, but I can't do it unless I'm also writing a book. And my buddy was just like, "You want to kill yourself because you're a chump." And he was like, "You need to write a book. You need to do what you're here to do." He's like, "You miss it, and so go do it." And he was right. And so I sat down and I started thinking a lot about why I became a writer. Right after that conversation, like, what did I love about books, and why did I do this, and what do I miss about it? And it sort of took me back to the beginning of my career as a writer. Even though for the first 10 years of it, I couldn't publish a book, and nobody knew who I was, and nobody cared. But it still started in Paris, right? And so I sat down and just started writing the book. And it was a relatively easy book to write, very quick. I wrote it in 4 or 5 months. And it was fun. It was a joy. It was a joy to just be writing again, to be stringing words together, to be telling a story, to be trying to make something that I loved. And that's how the book came about. And I still work for Webedia. I still work, do all the other stuff, make movies and video games and television shows. But I'm going to stay writing. I'm going to start another book soon. And I generally do my job during the day, go home, hang out with my wife, put my children to bed, and then I write late at night.
So you said it started, your career as a writer starts in Paris, but it starts actually in America. Well, at least Jay in the book reads Henry Miller, and he wants to be a writer. Is it really the one book that changed your life? And can we say that it's common for writers to have a book that tells them that this is the kind of life you need to have?
I think it's common for writers to have certain books that have inspired them to become writers. And for me, it was absolutely Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. I read it when I was 21, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it existed. I had read books my whole life, lots of them. I loved reading. But I always thought of writers as these like magical, gifted, extremely well-educated people, right? I was a shit-talking punk who liked to get drunk and do drugs and get in fights. I never imagined that I could be one of these writers, right? And then I read Henry Miller, and he was a lot like me.
From a different time?
From a different time. But he didn't go to Harvard, right?
Mm-mm.
He didn't grow up in Fontainebleau. He just loved books, and he wanted to be a writer. And I read that book, and the way I describe it, and I think I describe it this way, is it felt like somebody turned a light bulb on inside me, right? Before there was darkness, and then there was light. And I remember I closed that book, and I was sitting on a shitty couch in a shitty house, in a shitty room, in a shitty town in Ohio. And I was like, I'm going to do what that motherfucker does. I'm going to light some kid up like he just lit me up. I loved that Tropic of Cancer had been banned for 35 years. I loved that it could only be published in Paris for 35 or France for 35 years. I loved the art and sex and books that were in it. And I loved reading about the streets of Paris. And so I closed that book and I was like, I'm going to do what he did. I got to find a way to get there. I'd never been to France before. I didn't speak French. I'd only seen pictures of Paris. Mm-hmm. There was no internet. So like if you wanted to see a picture of Paris.
Remember, people who listen to us, there was a time where there was no internet and you had to go look for yourself, right?
You had to go to
there was no Google Map, Google View and stuff.
There was nothing. You had to go to a library and find a book on Paris to look at pictures of it. And certainly I had seen pictures of Tour Eiffel and Sacré-Cœur and Champs-Élysées and Le Louvre, but I had never been here. And you couldn't even quite imagine what it would be like from those pictures, right? Like, you just couldn't. So and so I hustled up some money and I came. And I remember I got off the plane and I had no idea what was ahead of me. And I came into Paris on a train and I got off the train and I was like, fuck. It's even more spectacular than I imagined. Sometimes Patrice Hoffman is the head of Flammarion, which published this book, tells me that I shouldn't be so effusive about Paris with the French because they have a cynical view of Paris. But I couldn't believe, just like when I read Tropic of Cancer and I couldn't believe it existed, I started wandering around Paris and I just couldn't believe it existed. It was beautiful and vibrant and dangerous, and there was art and books and beautiful girls everywhere. There were cafes, and I could have a coffee or a whiskey. There was Rue Saint-Denis, where I could go get in trouble and hang out with thugs and whores and buy drugs. And it felt electric to me.
This is the 90s, right? Early 90s?
Yeah, this is 1992. And I live not far from where we sit now. And I sort of laugh about Saint-Germain now because it's like rich and calm.
Bourgeois.
Way. Yeah. And certainly it was a little bit that when I came here, but not really. We were, like, Le Marais was dangerous, right? Like, you had to watch your back at night. Rue Saint-Denis was criminal.
Yeah, I used to work over there, yeah. I saw the prostitutes disappear a few years ago.
I used to go sit in cafes up in Faubourg Saint-Denis, right? So all the fuck-ups would sort of wander Rue Saint-Denis and get their drugs or their girls or whatever it was they were looking for, and then afterwards they'd go sit in the cafes in Faubourg Saint-Denis. And it was fucking awesome. Just a bunch of madmen. Just a bunch of crazy people sitting in Paris talking shit. And I just, day after day, I couldn't believe I was seeing the things I saw. You go see the Musée Rodin and you sit in front of the Gates of Hell. Or you go to the d'Orsay and there's 100 paintings, the 500 paintings that take your breath away. You walk into the Louvre. I still say, like, the idea that was somebody's house, right? The Louvre is just somebody's house that they turned into a museum. But the idea that was somebody's house.
It's true. It's fantastic, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned the Gates of Hell. That's where you meet Katrina, or where Jay meets Katrina. Who is Katrina? Is it a mixture of different women?
No, it was a single woman.
Is it single woman?
Yeah. It was a single woman. That was her name. Kind of pretty true to who she was. She was Norwegian. And I met her at the Gates of Hell, sitting on a bench.
And she changed your life?
Yeah. I mean, when I came here, I wanted great affairs, right? To have big, crazy... Like, you think about the affair between Rimbaud and Verlaine, right? Like, that's what I fucking wanted. I wanted some crazy affair to fall deeply in love, or to fall deeply in love 50 times. And I think that there's a certain type of person, a romantic, I guess, that we would be called, who chases things like love and pain and art and beauty and misery and melancholy. And I found all that with her. And I found that all in Paris. But I was sitting at the gates of hell just writing in a notebook. I used to go to sit there a lot, right? It's as nice as any park in Paris. Almost nicer, even though it's a museum. And there are those two little benches, and you can just sit there all day.
I'm asking you, but I don't really care if she exists or not, because I think that's what we like about your book. It's that you don't really know what's the truth or not. And I know in America it's been the main issue with your books and with Million Little Pieces from the start, that you're
No, you guys have a word for it, right? You call it autofiction.
Autofiction, right? But in America, they still don't understand it, and it's interesting because these days, what is the truth? When in a world of fake news, what is the truth? And what's the most? Is it really important to know the truth?
I don't think in literature or art it is. In literature or art, truth is whatever something makes you feel, right? I know when I sit down to write a book, I don't think about whether I don't hold myself to any standard except the standard of trying to make whoever ultimately consumes it feel something deeply. I don't care if I change something or manipulate something or embellish something or diminish something. That's part of the process of making art or of writing a book. And yeah, like a lot of Katerina is true and some of it's not. And hopefully you can't tell. And that's my job. My job isn't to write factual documents. My job isn't to tell you when I'm manipulating you or how. My job is to try to break your heart. And my job is to try to turn a light bulb on in your soul. And my job is to force you to take a position on what I do. My job is to make myself feel good about what I do and to enjoy the process of it.
Did the controversy around Million Little Pieces question that in you at some point?
No, it emboldened it.
Okay.
It emboldened it. I remember when the controversy blew up in America, and I had given dozens of interviews where I was like, no rule means anything to me. Mm-hmm. I'm not here to follow your fucking rules or live up to your expectations or standards. I do what I want to do, and I do how I want to do it. And it blew up, and if anything, it made me happy, right? When I set out to be a writer, I set out to be the most controversial, most divisive, most polarizing writer in the world.
Nice. That's what the Jay says in Katrina, actually.
And I pulled it off. Yeah. I pulled it off. Mm-hmm. I pulled it off. And for a while, for a certain period of time, it was just unpleasant to be in America because I was getting hounded. There would be reporters outside my apartment in New York City. They would follow me everywhere I went. So my wife and I just packed our bags and we came to France, right? And we lived in France for about 4 months in 2006. Philippe, actually from Katerina, his parents live in Beaulieu-sur-Mer in the south, and they have 2 houses there. And so we lived in one of their houses. And it was great. I just left. And I was like, fuck America. And came to France, where it sounds weird. I always say, like, this is my home. I don't live here, but this is the only place in the world where I feel at home. When I come to Paris or come really anywhere in France, I just feel like it's right. I don't know if that's because I'm of French descent and my grandfathers were both French, but I feel right here.
But you went back to America, so
I did. I mean, America. I feel at home here, but America is my home. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Henry Miller went back too. We all go back. But I was like, fuck it. And I remember thinking a lot about it, and I was like, you can either run from it or you can run into it, right? And the next book I wrote, which in France is called LA Story, the first sentence of it is, nothing in this book should be considered accurate or reliable. And that was me just lifting my fingers, right? Lifting my two middle fingers to the American press and the American critics and people in the American audience who hated me, and saying to them, I'm not going to change what I do because of you. I'm going to do it even more. Let's see if you can figure it out. And I remember we laughed. I before that book came out in America, I was like, listen, the other books, all they do is all they do is try to figure out what I'm lying about. I was like, you read this one, and all they're going to try to figure out is what's true. Mm-hmm. Even though I've said, don't consider anything, right? It's all bullshit. And I remember a New York Times reporter called and was like, yes, James, we've been going through, it was called Bright Shiny Morning in LA, in America, Bright Shiny Morning. And we've noticed that a lot of the facts and the historical elements
about California and
about Los Angeles are not actually real. How do you feel about the fact that you're once again lying to audiences by presenting real facts, by presenting made-up facts? And I was like, did you see on the front of the book where it says fiction? Mm-hmm. And she was like, yes. And I said, did you see at the front of the book where I said nothing in this book should be considered accurate or reliable? And she was like, yes. And I was like, well, why the fuck do I have to make real facts? And she was like, because you can't say something's a fact if it's not a fact. And I was like, we're not going to have this conversation. Fuck off. And I really I haven't talked to the American press in years. I don't do interviews there. I don't engage with them.
Do you think it's over? That they decided that you're a liar of American literature and you can't change anything about it?
I don't care.
You don't care, but that's the reason why there's a fracture between you and them.
Maybe. I was never part of their little club, and I never will be. We say there's a fracture, but A Million Little Pieces still sells 250,000 copies a year in America.
So it's like a lot.
It's sold.
It means also that if you take away all the controversy, all the questions about what's true, what's wrong, it still resonates strong with people who go through the same problems as the main character, right?
And if you think about the books that I love and the writers I love and the artists I love, they all got hammered in their lifetime too, right? I mean, were Baudelaire and Rimbaud beloved when they were alive and working? No. Like, what did people think of Celine? What did people think of Henry Miller? What did people think about Jack Kerouac or Charles Bukowski?
But right now it's a real issue that was brought up with the Weinstein story. In France, people are angry about Polanski, like in America. People are angry about Woody Allen, like in America. It seems that there's a politically correct wave all around the world, and which says that if you want to be a writer or a director or an actor, you have to have a perfect life. That's the way it goes these days. That's what Bret Easton Ellis says in his latest book, White. He calls.
Oh, Bret's one of my good friends. I had dinner with Bret in LA a couple weeks ago. We talk a lot about it.
And it's sad. It's very sad, right?
It is what it is, and you can either let it control your life or you can just ignore it. Clearly, I didn't.
You didn't care. You wrote it. You did it.
I don't think you can, as a writer or an artist, I don't think you can allow people's opinions to affect what you do, and I try not to. The game I want to play is not what people think of me now. It's what people think of me in 50 years or 100 years or 150 years. And I'm trying to write books that stand up against the cancer of time. That if you look back across the course of literary history, it's not the best reviewed books that last. It's the most controversial. We think, I can use an example of in France right now. Like Houellebecq. Houellebecq has a position in France similar to the position I have in America, right? He is almost equally beloved and equally hated.
Exactly.
And he gets annihilated by the media, and he doesn't care. He writes what he writes.
And that's why he doesn't want to do interviews. He didn't do any single interview for his last book, because he doesn't want the interviews that you interfere between him and his books and the readers, right?
Yeah, I respect it. I've taken the same position in the United States, right? I release the book. Whatever it does, it does. Whatever people think of it, they think of it. And I'll occasionally come to Europe to do interviews. I do a lot of interviews in France just because I like it here and because I feel like it's a much more reasoned, much more sophisticated, much more sort of relevant view of what books and art are and can be. I can have a real conversation about it here. In America, people just want to talk about,
the truth.
I mean, I get, today we're with the bad boy of American letters, James Fry. And I'm like,
It's always better than being the nice guy of American literature, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
I never would want to be like, I've said, I don't want to be beloved. I don't want people to want to give me a hug. I don't need that. I want to write books that fucking break their heart. I want to write books that sear themselves onto their souls and sear themselves into the fabric of my society. Books that are read in 50 years, if books are still read in 50 years at all.
That's a question I wanted to ask you. I've created this podcast because I wanted to talk about the joy of reading in today's world, because I was spending so much time on Twitter and Facebook and through controversies, and I was reading a lot. I was reading small pieces of discussions, but I couldn't find time to read books, and I wanted to go back to reading a lot of books, not just for my work but for my pleasure, and I wanted to share it with people. And we mentioned that before, but the answer people make these days is that they spend so much time on social networks that they can't read books anymore. Do you think social networks are killing the true reading, or it's so?
I think social networks are tearing societies apart, right? If you look at the influence of social networks on American society, it's all bad, right? They're Twitter mobs on the left and the right that seek out to destroy people, right? There's fake news. There's addiction to social networks. There's, social networks basically create depression and anxiety and hate. And I don't know how long they'll last, because I think a lot of people are coming to understand that there are far more negative influences from them than positive. I think people are coming to understand that social networks are essentially constructs designed to track you and steal information about you and from you, and that there's very little positive to them. I don't know. I frankly don't know if social networks will exist in 20 years or if books will. I would say if social networks are still dominating society, books' position in our culture will continue to diminish. And if social networks are if social networks' influence diminishes, books will sort of return to this important cultural position. I know what I hope happens, but I'm not a fucking fortune teller. But I think, we look in my job a lot at numbers, right? At simple data about book sales, because part of my job is trying to create book series, not literature the way I would say Katerina or the books that I actually write are, but commercial book series, often for your kids or young adults, that sell a lot of copies. And you can literally look at the numbers from 2008 when the first iPhone came out to 2011 when the first iPad came out to the rise of social networks, and you can see that reading among young people is diminishing greatly, and it's absolutely tied to the rise of technology and social networks, and it's just, will those things last or not? And I don't know. I hope not, but I do know, like, people used to think MySpace would rule the world, and it's gone.
And it disappeared, yes.
People used to think Facebook would rule the world forever, and it's dying pretty quickly.
Remember Napster also?
I mean, there was Napster, there was Friendster. There have been a lot of companies that were gonna rule the world, and hopefully we return to some state of reason. But I don't know if we will.
What have you been reading lately, since you read every day?
The book I'm reading right now is Neal Stephenson's new book. Do you know of Neal Stephenson? I think he's one of like America's greatest writers. I always say, and this is kind of an arrogant thing to say, that I judge writers by whether I think I could do what they do. Right? Could I write that book? 95% of the time, the answer is yes, but I wouldn't want to. There are few writers in the world whose work I know I couldn't do, and that, I don't know, it's equally intimidating and inspiring and fun to read. And Neal Stephenson is one of those writers. And
what's the name of his latest book?
So it's a sequel to his book called Reamdy that came out a couple years ago, and it is called Fall, or A Dodge in Hell, and it's about technology, and it's about, in a way, it's I don't know the French title, but Welbeck's Elementary Particles.
Particules élémentaires.
In a way, it's dealing with a lot of the same issues. At the beginning of Fall, a tech baron dies in a surgical procedure, and they keep him on life support and try to map his brain to make him immortal, and they do.
It sounds like a nice Black Mirror episode.
Yeah, it is kind of like, I'm only maybe 25% of the way in, but he's just such a dazzlingly good writer, and he writes about really serious issues in very accessible ways. Actually, in a way similar to Welbeck. He's a fucking great writer, and that's what I'm reading right now. Before that, I was reading a book called Boom, which is about the art market in America, and to a certain extent the global art market, but mostly the art market in America, and how sort of the rise of these mega galleries has changed not just the art market, but how artists make art, right? Yeah, I read a lot. I read every day.
Do you read crime novels?
Yeah.
You like them, yeah? Yeah,
I love crime novels. Like Michael Connelly. You ever read him? Like, I think he's my favorite crime writer.
You could do that at some point.
Write a crime novel?
Yeah, create a character that would come back to in different books.
Maybe. I think if I wrote a crime novel, I would write one. Like, do you remember? Have you ever read Mickey Spillane?
I heard about it. No.
Hard-boiled writer from the 50s in America. He's the most popular writer in America, and the books are just ridiculous. Ridiculous and awesome. Every Mickey Spillane book is the same, which his detective was Mike Hammer, right? And so Mike Hammer's in his office, and a beautiful but troubled woman comes in with the case, and he doesn't want to take the case, but he does, because he can't resist her. And they go down the road to try to solve the case.
And there would be a lot of, in your books, there will be, in your crime books, there will be a lot of sex, and maybe sex crimes, right?
So they used to think Mickey Spillane was a pornographer, because he wrote very graphically about sex in the 50s. I don't know if there'd be sex crimes in my book, but there'd be some fucking for sure. Yeah, I had a character that I came up with a few years ago. Instead of Mike Hammer, I was going to call him Jim Screw. But I might write a hard-boiled book. That won't be what I do next. I know what I'm going to do next, but it would be fun. Hopefully I have a bunch of years ahead of me to do a bunch of books. But I would write. I love crime books. My reading, people are always like, well, what do you read? And I'm like, I don't read to a pattern. Like, I don't read only novels or only literary novels or I read whatever interests me at any given time. And I think one of the joys of reading is walking into a bookstore without some preconceived notion of what you want. One of the greatest things about Paris is the sheer number of bookstores. Like before I came to see you, I was just walking around this neighborhood.
Exactly. There are many, yeah. Quartier Latin. Mm-hmm.
And then if you cross Saint-Germain, there's all on like Rue Dauphine and around there, all the ancient bookstores. Like the old, the like there's a bookstore over there that there's a couple of them that like sell letters that Baudelaire and Rimbaud and Verlaine wrote. Like I can go buy, or books that Baudelaire or Rimbaud didn't sign any books, but it's just extraordinary to me. And that America has become so corporate and so corporate owned that things like little bookstores are disappearing, right? Used bookstores, rare bookstores, they're just vanishing. There's a fraction.
Really disappearing?
Yeah.
Places in America where there's no bookstore around?
Yeah.
Only Amazon?
Yeah. And again, one of the things I love about Paris is just everywhere you look, there are books, there's art, there's food, there's love, there's sex, there's fucking life. You know, walking around this morning, I walked around for probably 2 hours, and all of those things were on display in abundance, and it was wonderful.
We didn't talk about the sex scenes. Many writers tell me that it's very difficult to write them. And I know that recently you won an award for the worst sex scene.
I did.
You were in competition with Murakami, I think. It's in a British newspaper. How do you explain that? Does it mean that maybe it's a very good sex scene? That's why they hated it.
I mean, in this book with sex, I was very direct about it, right? I didn't try to flower it up. I didn't try to make it anything other than what it was.
And it's a young man, 20-year-old. That's
a 21-year-old man fucking a 21-year-old model, often in public places. Mm-hmm. Most of the time we were drunk or on drugs. Like, it's not... It is what it is, and I wrote about it as simply and as directly and as authentically as I could. I don't know about other people, but I don't like quote poetry while I'm fucking, right? I want to taste and smell and feel ecstasy and joy and pleasure and desire and passion and lust. I like that I won the worst sex award. I thought it made me laugh. I don't remember what I sent them some statement, but I was like, thank you. I'm deeply proud to follow in the footsteps of former award winners like Philip Roth and Norman Mailer, and it was an honor to be nominated alongside Murakami. Yeah, in America you can't write or talk about sex anymore. It's stupid.
Because the first reviews I read about Katrina were all about those sex scenes. I was wondering if they went through the first 50 pages, because it's much more than that, and it's also a very, I'm not giving away the ending, but it's also a very sad and romantic book. It's not just about sex, right?
I mean, the book came out in America on the same day the Kavanaugh hearings started, okay. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Not a good time for a book by a 48-year-old white guy, a book about sex by a 48-year-old white guy to come out. I expected to get blasted once I knew, because we didn't know that those Kavanaugh hearings got scheduled like 2 weeks before. So as soon as we saw that schedule,
you knew what would happen.
Yeah. We laughed. It was like, oh fuck, get ready. And at the same time, I would read, people would send me the reviews and I would read them or glance at them. A lot of them made me laugh. There was one in London by some guy who calls himself a expert on Lord Byron, right? And he blasted me for writing about sex and drugs. And I was like, how the fuck can you be a fan of Lord Byron? Like the king of sex and drugs. And then fucking blast me. And I sent him a thank you note. I was like, dear whatever his name is, thank you very much for reading my book. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the thought you put into writing about it. And I was very sort of matter of fact and pleasant, just a thank you note, knowing that when I sent it to him, it would probably enrage him. And he sent me this screed back about how I was a blight on the literary world. And I was like, all right, man, cool. It's good to know I can still rile you up.
Talking to you, it seems that nothing can make you sad, or nothing can really shock you.
Things make me sad. I'm sad all the time, right? I have.
It doesn't show.
I don't know. I mean, I read this book in many ways is about sadness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sad when I'm writing a book. I know that. I'm not sad when I'm talking about a book. I'm not sad when I'm doing things that I love. Sometimes maybe I am. Being in love is sad. Being in love is as much sad as it is beautiful, and there's as much pain in it as there is joy. I know as we're sitting here speaking, I'm in a good mood. I'm in Paris. I'm in my favorite city in the world.
It's a very sunny, hot day in Paris. One of the hottest days in the year.
It's too sunny and too hot, but I'm still in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I woke up this morning and I had a cup of coffee in a cafe, and then I wandered around, and then I had another cup of coffee in another cafe, and then I walk over here to Flammarion, the fanciest, most prestigious publishing house in the world. And I hang out with Patrice, who's my friend and my editor and somebody I love. And I sit here with you, and you're cool and smart and love books. And what the fuck is there to be sad about today?
You're right.
Right? Maybe I'll be sad later. I don't know.
Wait next year when Donald Trump gets reelected
He
to
might.
be really sad.
He might. That'll be... He probably will. I mean, my wife and I have talked a lot about coming back here. She speaks French much better than I do. You heard me speaking French with Patrice, and I have very sort of basic guttural French. If I were here for a month or two.
A month or two, it would be fine, yeah.
It would be fine.
But you can still order baguette at the cafe, right?
Wait. I can... Out in the streets, I can only speak French, unless somebody asks me for directions. And then I switch to English. But it's usually dumb, lost Americans who are asking for direction. But it's a joy to be here. It's a joy to be here. It was a joy to have written this book. It was a joy to think about the days in Paris when I was young and free and reckless and stupid and full of ambition and fire and ready to burn the fucking world down. It's fun to come back here with this book because, like, this is where my life started in a way, right? The day I stepped off that plane and I started wandering. And that's all I did when I lived here. I didn't have much money, and I wandered, and I lived. I felt and looked and tasted, and it was magnificent.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
James, for your time.
Thank you.
And
thank you for reading my book.
And I hope that the next one will come out soon.
It won't come out soon, but I know what it is, and I have started writing it. Not much of it. Mm-hmm. It's about some of the things we touched on a little bit here. It's about political correctness and social media and fake news and truth and politics and about the collapse of America. Because that's happening. Okay, don't throw away the first pages in the Seine. In the Seine? I don't like throw them away. Katrina. I don't throw them away anymore. Yeah, there's 3 rotten books of mine. Somewhere in the Seine, yeah. Thank you very much, James. Bye. Thank you.
C'est la fin de cet épisode. Vous pouvez en retrouver des extraits en français sur lci.fr dans la page dédiée au podcast. Nous, on se retrouve vite pour un nouvel épisode des gens qui lisent sont plus heureux. Je vous dis à bientôt et bonne lecture.